Hi there, and welcome to my mushroom forest embroidery pattern tutorial. In this tutorial, I'll be stitching the pattern on the back of this denim jacket of mine. So you can pick anything you want to embroider on. The back of a jacket works really nicely, but you could do a tote bag, a sweater, whatever you want. To start, make sure that your fabric is nice and flat on a hard surface. Then grab your pattern sticker and kind of figure out where approximately you want to place it on the garment. Once you know that, making sure your hands are nice and clean and dry, find the edge of the sticker and carefully peel it away from the backing, like so. Because this sticker is quite long, just be mindful that it doesn't fold over onto itself. Place the sticker down onto the fabric, make sure you've got it in the right spot, and then begin smoothing it out so that the sticker fuses nicely with the fabric. Throughout your stitching process, the sticker may pop up a little bit in places, and then you can just stick it right back down. So for this tutorial, I'll actually be stitching upside down. The reason for that is that it's easier to access the pattern through the top of the jacket versus from the bottom, where you'd be kind of having a lot of additional fabric to work around. So that's why it's going to be stitched upside down. We're going to get started now with the stitching, starting from this first flower. So the first color we'll be working with is DMC 500, which is a very dark green. Embroidery floss is made up of 6 strands, as you can see. And throughout this project, we're going to be splitting our floss. So for this first stem, we're going to be working with 2 strands of floss. So you're going to separate the floss by slowly pulling it away. Now you're going to thread your needle. I like to wet the end and then slowly pull it through. For this project, I'm going to have you have the ends meet and tie a double knot. I know some people don't stitch this way, but I just find for beginners, this is the easiest way to kind of explain it. So if you don't want to stitch this way, you're actually going to be working with 4 strands of floss versus 2 doubled over. So once you have your secure double knot, your needle and thread should look something like this. In terms of the length of the floss, I do about an arm's length to start. You can do more if you feel comfortable with it. I'm using a DMC size 5 needle, and without further ado, let's get to it. So to start, take your needle and thread, go underneath the fabric and find the bottom of that stem of the first flower. And you're going to push your needle through the fabric and pull it all the way through until you can't pull it anymore. You're going to do about a 1 centimeter stitch length and go back down through the fabric. This is just a straight stitch to begin with. The next thing you're going to do is jump about the same stitch distance ahead and come up through the fabric. Pull your needle through, and then you're going to come back down through the tail end of that previous stitch and pull through. What we're doing to create the stem is called back stitch, and you're going to continue this exact process to fill in the entirety of this stem. So once again, you're jumping up a stitch length like so, pulling your needle all the way through and coming back down through the tail end of the previous stitch. And just make sure it's nice and tight and so that your line is nice and even. The key to the stitch is doing even stitch lengths so that it looks uniform. When you're finished, your stem should look something like this. Now, I just want to show you what it looks like on the back side. I'm just going to show you for this first one, and then I'll assume that you'll do this throughout the project. You're going to, when you're finished with a color, give yourself enough room to tie a double knot, like so. And then once your double knot is tied, you're going to trim that as well. If you were to run out of floss without being finished a section, just make sure you leave yourself enough room on the back side to tie that knot, and then rethread your needle and start from where you left off. Okay, so moving on to the actual flower part of this plant, we're going to be using DMC 519, 2 strands again, doubled over and tied in double knot. So just like before, you start from the underside of the fabric. You can pick any flower to start at. And I'm just going to come up at the bottom of this one, pull all the way through, and do a stitch the length of the flower. And then you're going to come back up, doesn't matter which side, and just continue to fill in that shape of the flower. This is called satin stitch. Satin stitch is a nice filler stitch. The idea is to create nice, smooth stitches that resemble satin, and you can use it to fill in an object such as this little flower. It'll probably take about 4 stitches to fill in this particular one. So once you've finished doing all the flowers, yours should look something like this. Next, we're going to use DMC 747, 2 strands again, doubled over and tied in a double knot. And we're just going to use it to do these tiny little straight stitches that represent the little bits hanging out of the flowers. So just very simple like that. So once you've completed that, yours should look something like this. So we'll move on to the next plant, and we're going to start off with the stem. We're going to use DMC 3362. This time I'm just using 1 strand doubled over and tied in a double knot. I'm going to start off just the same way from the underside of the fabric and coming up through the bottom of the stem. Pull the needle through, and just like before, I'm going up about a 1 centimeter stitch length, coming back down through the fabric, and then I will come up again about 1 centimeter ahead, and then come back down through the tail end of the previous stitch. And I'm going to repeat the same process until the full stems are filled in on this plant. So once you're finished, you should have something that looks like this. Now for the leaves, we'll continue with the same color, 3362, but this time I'm doing 2 strands of floss doubled over. So now I'm going to start from the underside of my fabric at the top point of the first leaf, and I'll pull the floss all the way through. And to fill in the leaves, I'm doing the same process as I did for the flowers, where I'm just filling in the full shape of the leaf with satin stitch. So the idea is to have nice, smooth stitches and follow the shape of the leaf. Each leaf will probably take me about 3 to 4 stitches to fill in. And once you've finished, yours should look something like this. So moving on to our next little plant, you're going to be using DMC 732, just 1 strand doubled over, tied in a double knot. And exactly the same as what we've done before, we're using our back stitch to fill in the stem. And after you fill in the stem, you can do those little leaves as well, using the same amount of floss and using your satin stitch. And once you've finished, yours should look something like this. Next, we're going to switch to DMC 3713. We're going to use 3 strands of floss doubled over, and we're going to fill in these cute little petals with just single straight stitches. So 2 for each flower. And when you're done, yours will look like this. So we're going to move on to these little skinny mushrooms where you're going to use DMC 07, just one strand doubled over to start. Start from the underside at the bottom of one of these stems and come all the way through. Now you're going to use back stitch like you have been doing before to come up the length of the actual stem. And then right beside that line, that first line, you're going to do another one because as you can see, it's going to be too skinny, your first line, to fill in the actual full stem. So I have my first length of stitching there, and I'm going to just stitch again another line of back stitch right beside it. You can do the same thing for these other stems as well. So here's what it looks like when you've filled in all the stems. And now we're going to do the tops of the mushrooms. So same color floss and same amount. Again, you're starting from the underside and I'm coming up through the top of one of these mushrooms, pulling all the way through and stitching the length of the actual mushroom. And I'm just going to follow the shape, but not that little under part because we're going to do a different color there. And I'm just going to fill it in slowly using my satin stitch technique. And I'll do that for all of the little mushroom tops. And once you're finished, yours should look something like this. The next thing I'm going to do is fill in these little undersides with DMC 08, one strand of floss doubled over. And I'm just going to do these little filler stitches, so still satin stitch, maybe 2 or 3 on each side, just to give that effect of a little shadow going on the underside of each mushroom. When you finished, yours should look something like this. Moving on to the next plant, this one's going to be done the exact same way as our second plant here. I'm using DMC 3011, one strand of floss doubled over, and I'll start with the stems. You guys are pros now at the back stitch, so I don't think I need to show you again. This is how yours should look. Next, we'll do the leaves. You're using the same color, but you're switching to 2 strands of floss doubled over, and same method, satin stitch to fill in the leaves. And when you're finished, yours should look like this. Okay, we're moving on to our mushrooms here. The stems, I'm going to be using DMC 3033, and I'm doing 2 strands of floss doubled over, coming up through the underside of the fabric. I'm going to do a small, like 1 centimeter stitch length, kind of in the middle here. And then I'm going to jump up a little bit higher and bring that stitch back down. And the next stitch I do is going to be similar in length to my first stitch. And it's going to be right beside it. And I'm going to go kind of like this, doing one long and one short, row by row. This technique is called long and short stitch. And the idea of it is to give your stitches kind of like a blended, painted look where, because of the uneven lengths of the stitches, it kind of flows together nicely without seeing big lines defining stitch lengths and gaps in the work. You can kind of play around with this. It doesn't have to be perfect. This is kind of how people do what's called a thread painted technique. And you're just going to work your way up the stems of both of these mushrooms playing with this technique. Everyone's will look a little bit different, but the idea is just not to have like bold lines showing exactly where your stitch length ends. And by doing the long and short, it's kind of more jagged and has an effect of blending. When you're finished, your stems should look something kind of similar to this, but obviously everyone's will be a bit different. Now we're going to fill in the top part of the stems. This one's a little easier. We're just going to do satin stitch. So same amount of floss, same color, and just fill in those shapes using our satin stitch as we've done many times before. Okay, so once you're done, yours will look sort of like this. We're going to focus now on the tops of the mushroom. I'm using DMC 355, 2 strands doubled over. I'm going to use that same thread painting technique to fill in the mushroom tops. The reason I'm not going to do satin stitch is it's a pretty big surface area and I want the stitches to be more secure. So the thread painting technique will make the stitches more secure. So I'm going to follow the exact same method that I used before. I'm going to start at the bottom of each top of the mushroom, and I'll probably do about 3 rows of long and short stitching. Now, you're going to be covering up these little spots that I've drawn on the pattern. It's easier to do it this way than doing the spots first and then trying to stitch around them, I think. So when we do those spots, they'll be covered up with the red, obviously, but then when we go back and do them, you can look at the picture and you can kind of put them wherever you want, or you can follow the pattern and put them where I've put them. So once you finish with the mushroom tops, yours should look something like this. I'm now going to fill in the underside using DMC 3862, obviously just of this larger mushroom. I'm just using 1 strand because I want nice delicate stitches here. And you're just going to be using your satin stitch to fill in this full length. One suggestion I do have is make sure you're following the actual shape with your stitches of this bottom part, because the direction of the stitches will change the way the mushroom looks on the underside, and you want all the stitches to kind of be at that nice angle pointing towards the middle. So I like to jump ahead like this, like leave a gap, and just to make sure I'm on track with the direction of my stitches, and then I'll go back after and fill in the spots that I missed. But that way I can kind of control the direction of the stitches a little bit better. Okay, so once I'm all finished with that, it's time to add the spots onto the mushroom. So, like I said before, you can reference the actual pattern and follow exactly where I had those spots, or you can just put them wherever you want. It's totally up to you. So I'm going to use DMC Blanc, which is white. I'm using 2 strands of floss doubled over, and I'm going to come up through the underside of the fabric, and doesn't matter where you start. Coming up, and I'm just going to do a small stitch length to represent the spot. If you want the spot to appear thicker, you want to do a second one right over top of where you just were. But in this case, I'm okay with that small size. And this is really all you do. Whenever you're satisfied with the amount of spots, you can say you're all finished and move on to the next plant, which has some cute little berries on it. So I'll fill in the stem to start using DMC 3362, and I'm using backstitch. And once the stem is in, I'm using the same color floss, 3362, but I'll do 2 strands of floss doubled over, and then I'm using that same technique of satin stitch to fill in these nice leaves. So for the berries, I'm going to use DMC 3836, 2 strands doubled over. I'm going to use satin stitch and fill in the entire round shape of each berry. So when you're finished, you should have something that looks like this. Now, to fill in the little bumps that are in each berry, you're going to use DMC 3041, 2 strands doubled over, and I'm going to do a stitch called a French knot. So for those of you who have not experienced a French knot before, I'll demonstrate one. You're coming up through the underside of the fabric, and you're wrapping once, twice, holding it tight, and coming back down right beside where you came up. Just make sure that that stays tight like that. And while you keep the tension, you're pulling through on the underside to make that nice little knot. I'll do it again. So coming up through the fabric, right in the middle of, or just on the top of your berry there, with your non-dominant hand, wrapping twice, coming back down. Sorry, you can't see so well. Holding that tension and pulling it through so that you have a nice tight little knot. If you're really struggling with the French knot, don't worry, you can always use a little straight stitch in its place. Okay, moving right along to our little snail. For this one, feel free to stitch it whatever colors you want. I'm doing DMC 3046 for the body part. That's what we'll do first. So for this, we're actually just going to fill it in using our satin stitch. I'm going to start in the middle just because I want to, and I'm just going to do stitches across like so until I've filled in the entire shape of the snail's little body. Once I have that filled in, I'm just going to use straight stitch to do the 2 antennae, like the 2 little lines. And then I'll do a little French knot on the top of each. Again, if you don't want to do a French knot, you don't have to. You can fill in that little circle just with straight stitches. However you want to do it is fine. For the snail's belly, I'm using DMC 781, just one strand doubled over. And again, I'm going to use satin stitch just to fill in this shape of the little belly here. Once you've got that in, you can move on to the shell. For the shell, I'm going to be using DMC 840, two strands doubled over. And I'm using satin stitch, but I really want to be careful to follow the shape of the shell because the way your stitches are stitched for this particular part will impact how much it will look like a shell. So I'm actually going to follow this spiral pattern as much as possible when I fill it in. With the satin stitch. And again, you can use that technique I showed you from the bottom of the mushroom to keep yourself on track with the direction of the stitches. When you're done, you should have something that looks like this. I'm now going to use DMC 310, which is black floss, and I'm using one strand doubled over, and I'm going to go around these lines just to really help define them, and I'm going to add a little smile and eyes to our snail. So I'm just going to use back stitch for that. These should be really nice thin lines that kind of just hide, but kind of bolden the shape a tiny bit. So when you're finished, you should have something like this. I'm now going to move on to these king trumpet mushrooms. I'm going to start at the top. I'm using DMC 167, two strands doubled over. And I am going to use satin stitch to fill in the shape of the top. And I'm going to make sure that I follow the exact shape so that in my stitches it reflects that sort of folded look. So once I get to this point, I'm actually going to follow the shape all the way around the corner there. So I'm going to have my stitches actually like turn the corner. And here's how it should look when you're done. So for the stems of these mushrooms, I'm going to be using that same thread painting technique that I used on the previous mushrooms. I'm using DMC 613, and then I'm also going to go back and add those defining lines. So this is what it should look like once you finish the thread painting technique. And now I'm using DMC 08, just one strand, and I'm going to go back and add those lines just with my back stitch. They don't have to be perfect. Again, like you did with the previous mushrooms, you can look to the original pattern to see where they were, but you can also just add them wherever you like. I also decided to do a line underneath the top to define that more as well. Okay, so moving on to our second last plant, we're going to use DMC 3013, just one strand of floss doubled over, and you're going to fill in the stem using backstitch. And once you finish with the stems, using the same color, switch to 3 strands of floss doubled over. You're going to fill in the little ivy leaves using satin stitch. Don't worry about getting the shape bang on. As long as it looks a little bit like what I've drawn out in the pattern, you'll find that the effect will come through in the pattern. So moving on to our very last plant here, this one you're just going to be using the same backstitch technique, DMC 500, one strand of floss doubled over, you'll fill in the stems, and then for the leaves, using the same color, switch to 2 strands doubled over, and you'll use your satin stitch for the leaves. So congratulations, you've finished the stitching, and now all that's left is to wash off the stabilizer. To wash off our stabilizer, you're going to put the garment under lukewarm to hot water, and you're going to let the water run over top of it while you rub away the stabilizer. You should immediately see it start to dissolve. You may have to rub at it a little bit to get away all of the stickiness, but just carefully and gently over your stitches do this until all the stabilizer has dissolved, and then I like to rinse it for a few more minutes even after that, just to make sure all the stickiness is gone. Once you've finished with the washing, you can gently wring out some of the excess water, which will just help your garment dry a little bit faster.